Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar about performance testing. Accelatis' CEO, Jonathan Berry, will talk about various types of performance testing in this 21-minute series. This is the first of our deep dive series on the topic. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them in the GoToWebinar chat window. We will take a few minutes at the end and answer them, and then the remaining we will answer directly to you. We will also provide additional information at the end on how to get slides and a recording for today's presentation. And with that, take it away, Jonathan.
Thanks, Brittany. Cool. So thanks everyone for joining. So again, in the 21-minute format, we're going to move kind of quickly. We'll take a little bit of time to talk about the company background, do a little bit about performance testing in general, go specifically through different test types, and talk about some other considerations, including scheduling. And then at the end, we'll cover a little bit about what Accelatis has to offer and actually do a quick comparison to LoadRunner. So firstly, just a little bit of background on me. For those who don't know me, I was an original member of the Hyperion Financial Management team. I ran the engineering team through 2008 before founding Accelatis, and Accelatis was really based on the need for a comprehensive management and monitoring solution that could support Hyperion. And what we've done is we've built really the first system from the ground up that has a focus on both IT as well as the business user. So in the Accelatis solution built on our platform, we handle management from both an IT and business standpoint, automation, auditing, including SOX auditing and other change audit tracking, log management, performance monitoring, so that's server monitoring, infrastructure monitoring, as well as end user monitoring. We offer performance testing suite, which kind of dovetails with what we're talking about today. And we round it out with a support desk offering as well as comparative benchmarking. So for those who aren't familiar with the product, reach out to us. We'll be happy to give you a little more info. But today we're really focusing on performance testing best practices as it applies to any tool. And at the end, we'll cover a little bit about how Accelatis plays in that space. Okay. So first and foremost is kind of a universal truth, and what we've seen is that the best managed Hyperion environments, and I think this is true for really any enterprise software, they all leverage performance testing throughout the software lifecycle. So they're all very progressive companies that know how to use the right amount of performance testing in the right places. And it really comes to a common fallacy that which kind of led to doing this webinar and this presentation in the first place, is that we often hear that people consider performance testing as one thing. They think of it as the big bang stress test that you do when you have a new environment, or even worse, they do it because it's a checkbox on a project plan without a lot of thought as to why they're doing it or how they're going to use the information that comes out of it. But in reality, there's actually many different types of performance testing, and we're going to cover those at a high level today, and then as part of our deep dive series, we'll go through each one in more detail so you can really walk away with understanding how you can perform them in your own environment and how to take advantage of the results. Okay. Another thing to note is that, the usage of performance testing is going to vary from company to company. It depends on where you are in your life cycle. Is it a brand new environment? Are you mature in that environment? Do you have a more mature team? Are you on all latest patches? There's a lot of factors that will come into play as to how you apply performance testing. So our goal today is really to get you to understand what's out there and what's available, and then we can talk about how to best apply it. Okay. The thing that's common with all these is that testing serves one core purpose, and that's to really reduce risk. So regardless of when you're using it and how you're using it, you're really just trying to reduce risk in your environment. Okay? So let's get into it, and let's talk about the various types of performance testing. Okay? And we'll start out with what we call baseline testing. And as we go through these, you might hear different terms for the same type of testing, so I'll try to call out where I think that applies. So you might hear benchmark testing or baseline testing. And what we look at as baseline testing is really taking a snapshot, a single point in time of various documents or activities in an environment. So it's usually done in a controlled environment, and you're really just trying to say at this point in time, this is, and usually it's under optimal conditions, this is how various things perform. And they could be an S-based calc, a financial report, an OBIE dashboard, a PeopleSoft form, whatever it might be. Okay, and this is something that's usually good to do for new environments or when there's major changes, and this kind of comes into what we'll look at with regression testing a little bit later, but you're really just trying to say, where do we stand right now? So let's take what it could look like. So this is taken from something we call an environment compare report. So we're actually baseline two environments and compare them together. So if you look at these columns, this is where we were comparing an 11.113 to 11.122 environment, and we baselined every financial report in the system, and then we compare them and do some traffic lighting. But the idea is that it's a single user test against all these different documents or activities, and it's performed in a controlled environment. So we can look at this and say, the baseline for the cash flow report is, 50 seconds or whatever it might be. So we have something to work with as we look at performance down the road. In this case, this is just an interesting application of baselining where we're comparing two environments to see if there's any fundamental differences. Okay. Performance testing. So let's talk about stress, which again is what most people think about when they hear performance testing, capacity testing. So stress testing is really trying to determine how your environment's going to perform under load. And you can do this by simulating user activities and ramping up the user count over time and really doing what most people think of as a day in the life. So I'm going to have a user log in. They're going to do various activities, whether it's forms, planning forms, smart view sheets, calcs, consolidations, and then we're going to log out. And then we're going to replicate that and scale that up so that we can simulate multiple concurrent users on the system at any time, and we want to see how the system's going to react. And the goal is to really determine where the bottlenecks are so that we can scale to higher levels of concurrency. Again, this is generally a more expensive type of test because of the people involved, the tools involved, access to the environment. And really what we want to do is look at how to read the results. But I want to talk about capacity testing, which is a slight variant of stress testing. Capacity testing is something that we promote greatly with our tool in addition to stress testing, and it's very similar. You're going to analyze the results the same, but the difference between capacity testing and stress testing is that stress testing is really trying to look at what kind of a real user is doing in an environment, really more of a day-in-the-life type scenario, where capacity testing is more nuanced, and we're looking at very, very discrete activities. And the idea is that with capacity testing, although we're going to run it in much the same way, is that we'd be able to tell very small changes to the infrastructure. So if you're adding memory, changing a CPU, tweaking JVM settings, something that could be even subtle, we should be able to see the difference in capacity testing because it's very focused. It could be like logging in, opening up a form, logging out. Let's see how much of that throughput we can do in a very short amount of time. Where stress testing, there's much more moving parts, so you might not be able to notice the difference when making small changes. So they each have their place. And the results are going to look very similar. So we're going to go through several resulting graphs, and they're going to look very much the same, meaning you're going to see lines plotted on a graph, and the lines are going to go up or down. But what we're measuring and how we're going to interpret it could be different. So for stress and capacity testing, what you're looking at here is each one of those dots, and we did it for 3 different tests: reports, planning, and HFM. So that's what the lines are, blue, green, and red. And each one of the dots is an average response time at a certain concurrency level. So that average response time could be comprised of 500 different tests. It's an average response time. And you can see that it's at different concurrency levels. So as we scale up the concurrency from 10 to 50 to 100 to 150, you can see that the Hyperion planning stays pretty flat, which means that in this environment, it supports 150 users with the same performance that it can support 10 users. So that's all great. But with HFM and reports, they showed a similar, what we call, point of inflection. This is where the system starts to degrade non-linearly. It's no longer graceful degradation, so it starts sloping up. And if we put more load on the system, these lines are going to go vertical and bad things are going to happen. But you were interpreting the data the same way. So we're running activities. We're looking at the average response time at certain levels of concurrency, and our goal is to move that point of inflection as far right as possible. So we run a test, we do some remediation, and then we run it again, and hopefully that point of inflection moves off to the off to the right. Okay? Concurrency testing. Similar but different than stress testing. Where stress testing, the goal is to determine where the system, whether it starts to fail or whether it starts to bottleneck. Concurrency testing is really the idea that you could put some load on the system and you're not straining it, but you're doing something other than single user performance. So you could run a single user test all day long and you're not going to experience the conditions that you would under certain levels of concurrency. So the idea of the concurrency is that you're not going to necessarily run it all the time. Maybe it's on a regular basis, maybe it's on a weekly basis, and you're not going to put so much load that you're going to strain the system or cause things to fail, but you want to see how the system performs under a certain amount of load over a regular period of time, because things will be exposed under concurrency that you're not going to see with a single user test. So again, we promote that these types of things be done on a regular basis, and if you can automate it, then it's very inexpensive to run. And the results, again, on the surface, this was very similar to what we just saw, but it's actually a little bit different. We're looking at average response times for concurrency, but we're doing it over time. So this is a single concurrency. So let's say that this was a 50-user test for an HFM form, a planning form, and a financial report. And this was taken once a week over the last 7 weeks. So every week we're going to run a test, and the idea is that we want to determine if before we go into our next budgeting cycle or financial close, we want to determine whether there's going to be any user issues at concurrency that might have crept in during the cycle that we would not necessarily experience with a single user test. And a stress test might be too expensive for a number of reasons, and we also don't want to push the system until it breaks. This is going to give us a good feeling that at concurrency that things are performing the way that we expect. But it's something, again, we're not going to necessarily run it every hour, every day, but we run it on a regular basis so that we can be alerted to trends that are going in the wrong direction. Okay, longevity test. This is one, this has been called, I hear it called SOAP test. The idea of this is that we're going to run a system for an extended period of time. So when we do other types of testing, whether it's concurrency testing, stress testing, you can usually get results in a short amount of time. Short being, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. But things are going to expose themselves when you run them over longer durations, like a day or 2 days or 3 days. And this was something that we did extensively at Hyperion. And it's something where it's really good when you have a brand new version of software or some new hardware to do this type of testing, because you could uncover things like whether it's a memory leak or some type of intermittent issue, that it's a timing issue and it's only going to happen very infrequently. So again, not something that you necessarily run all the time. We actually see very few people who do this regularly, but this is something in a new environment, especially after software upgrades, can be very important. And this is a graph of some data that was taken from one of our systems here, and it's really interesting. So again, lines on a graph, but we're measuring some very different things. We're measuring KPIs here, so we're measuring over time, we're measuring memory, CPU, disk space, as well as some special HFM handle count. So you'll see a green line and a purple line, they're flat. That means that the disk the CPU. You see something a little funny happening around 1 p.m. on the 22nd. The line is memory. So what's interesting is that for the first 9 hours of this test, all the resources were nice and flat. So if we ran this test for 8 or 9 hours and stopped, we'd say, hey, this system's in good shape. Everything's leveled out, it's flat, it's stabilized. Okay? But something funny happened after like 10 hours or so, or after 12 hours, is that you start to see the memory usage going up, so the available memory is going down. Okay, we would not have seen that had we stopped the test earlier. And something really interesting is later on, there was some type of event where you can see the CPU going up a little bit, then it spikes, and boom, memory drops significantly. So we had a drop of about 50% memory over the course of this test that we would not have seen had we run it in 10 hours. And if you want to know, this is actually real data off a real system, something that I was not expecting to see, so it was kind of interesting when we got it. And when we do our deep dive on longevity testing, we'll go in and talk more about this particular graph. Okay, so regression testing, this is going to be our next deep dive. Regression testing, and really the most progressive companies do a lot of this. It's an extension of the baseline test, something where you're running something on a regular basis. And the idea is that you're going to pick some key benchmark activities and you're going to run them regularly, let's say daily. And you're really looking for performance trends that are going in a direction that you don't want, where performance slows down. So you're going to pick some fixed set of data points. And a data point could be a particular type of test or a document. And of course, we want to automate this. So here are 3 items. We did an HFM consolidation, a generic script, and an S-based calc. And here what you can see is that the HFM consolidation in red and the script in purple stay relatively flat. And you can see that we did 1 test a day. So every day we're testing these data points. So again, effectively our baseline test, but something that we're running over time and that we're measuring, looking for changes. And you can see here that we deviated from the baseline on our S-based calc. And that could be something like this could be caused from, because it's a single user test, it's likely not a concurrency problem, but it could be something where there's more data in an application, the data volume is growing, so our calc is taking longer to run. But by running the regression test, and you could get these results in a table or a graph. I like graphs because it's more visual. But it's going to jump out at us that something is going south there, and we could be alerted to it so that we can act on it. Okay. The last one is what we call an integrated health check, and this is where we take all the neat health checks, whether it's a synthetic transaction or whether it's something like a URL probe, and we run them on a regular basis. So this is something that we've seen some people do manually. We do it as part of our product. And the idea is that we're running things constantly in the background so that you're going to know in your system, and you're going to know hopefully before your users find out. So here's a graph that took place over, I think, a little bit less than 24 hours. And you'll see everything's pretty stable. And here we're doing things like we're doing some network connectivity checks. We're doing a ping check. We're doing a synthetic transaction where we're simulating an HFM grid action. We're doing a basic URL. We're doing a couple URL probes. Every minute or every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes. Or if it's a little more expensive, like a synthetic transaction, you might do it every hour or more or less frequently. An interesting thing here is you can see everything's flat until the end, and this was the same data that came off that system where we had that significant event. You'll see it's happening at the same time. And you can see this is where we would trigger an alert to say, oh, the synthetic transaction that's trying to test whether HFM is working, look, it went from less than a second to 3 seconds, and it sustained it, meaning it wasn't just a fluke, it happened multiple times. So boom, an alert gets triggered. So even without users on the system, by integrating health checks and performance type health checks into the system, you can have a very proactive way of monitoring your environment and be alerted before users have an issue. Okay, so a couple quick things on scheduling. So those are the core test types. A couple of core things on scheduling. This is a very conceptual schedule of a product implementation, and the boxes in black are the different steps to prepare the migration, install the software, configure, migrate the app, eventually roll out. The blue elements are where you can inject performance testing, and normally people might just think about the stress testing right before we do the rollout, but here you can see that you can baseline the old environment, baseline the new environment. You do various capacity testing, you do iterations of stress testing, do a longevity test before a rollout. And then once you roll out, you can integrate regularly scheduled regression tests, concurrency tests, and health checks. So it's a way of being very proactive with integrating performance testing into a deployment. Okay. Logically, the thing with a stress test is that you do all the preparation, and you really need to prepare for doing a number of iterations. So the idea of a stress test is to determine bottlenecks, but you need to provide time to fix the problem. So one of the big catch-22s is that performance testing is often scheduled only at the end, and the original schedule may not provide for multiple iterations to fix problems. And then as other things get delayed, performance testing often gets squished and compressed. So that what's interesting is performance testing is there to reduce the risk, but delays in the schedule, which are naturally adding risk, are cutting out the process to de-risk it in the first place. So it becomes a problem. So it's really about thinking about this ahead of time and planning for it in the schedule. Okay, so just to wrap up a little bit about Accelatis, we offer multiple performance testing solutions in our suite. We have an express load tool, really easy to get started. We'll talk a little bit about that. Everything we do is supposed to be actionable. And the idea is that with Accelatis as a platform, you can replay past activities. So you can take a close that occurred on 11.113 and replay it, resimulate it in 11.124 to see how the system would respond. And of course, we have enterprise solutions to be able to schedule these things, generate load from different locations, and of course, integrated health checks. A quick comparison of us versus LoadRunner. A big part of our solution is that we have prepackaged tests, pre-scripted tests, so that it largely eliminates a lot of the script recording with LoadRunner. And because our integrated monitoring offers a lot of very deep Hyperion capabilities, the remediation phases are usually a lot quicker. So in general, we can do a run much quicker than with LoadRunner. Here are some actual examples, and I think this is the last slide. Just some real-world examples of some things we've done in the last couple months where we've taken a project that was going to be a LoadRunner project and cut significant time off of it. Some of these were run by us. Some of them were run by our partners. Some of them the client ran directly. Just a couple points on the bottom. We did one where the savings were not applicable because the LoadRunner was never in consideration because they only had 3 days to script and run the tests. So we're able to squeeze into spaces that LoadRunner wasn't. And there was another one where it didn't save any time, but what happened was our partner was able to, the time that they would have spent scripting, they spent doing much more high-value work on remediation for the client. So the client got a lot more out of it, but the budget was effectively the same, but they got a lot more value out of it. So people often ask us how we compare to LoadRunner. I thought that this would kind of help put it into perspective. Okay. So I think we're a minute over, but just to kind of wrap up, again, for today's slides or an assessment of your performance testing project, reach out to Cameron Morris. His email is here. We'll be launching our deep dive series. So we're going to go through each one of the performance test types that we did, that I covered. We're going to start with regression testing and really go through how to set up the test, what to track, specifically how to read the results and how to act on it. April 28th, regression testing followed up by the other test types, again in the 21-minute format, so won't use all of your time. And you can register for that today on accelatis.com/webinars. So we'll take a couple of questions that came in. So the first one is, does Accelatis support non-Hyperion applications? Okay, so Accelatis was actually, from that platform slide, Accelatis was actually built to support any application. We do special stuff with Hyperion, so we have hooks into the API for SBase and HFM and reports and others, so we have a lot of built-in Hyperion knowledge, but Accelatis as a platform really will support any application. And the other question here is, what partners do you work with? So we're talking about LoadRunner and working with partners. So we actually work with several partners around the world. So if someone if they're working on a project, just contact us directly and we'll be happy to talk to you about that. So we have some partners who have been certified and can work with you right away. Otherwise, if you're working with someone, we can certainly work with them to get them trained so that they can use Accelatis in your environment. Okay. One last question is, does this performance testing suite require a separate license from Accelatis, from the Accelatis suite? So there's a number of ways that can happen. It's included as part of our Center of Excellence suite, but it is possible to use performance testing on its own, and there's a number of ways that can happen through us or through a partner. So I would just recommend that you contact us directly and we can talk to you about that. Okay. So again, the contact information is here. Thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at our next